Robert E. Lee had already made up his mind about Ulysses S. Grant before the two men ever faced each other across a battlefield. Grant, in Lee's estimation, and in the estimation of most Confederate officers, was a mediocre man who had failed at nearly everything he had ever tried. A washed-up drunk who'd resigned from the peacetime army under a cloud, a failed farmer, a failed businessman, a man selling firewood on street corners in St. Louis just 7 years before he'd be handed command of every Union army in the field. Lee was wrong about almost all of it, and that misjudgment would cost him his army, his cause, and the war. This video is about the gap between the man Robert E. Lee thought he was fighting and the man who actually brought him to Appomattox Courthouse. Grant's reputation in the South, and honestly in large parts of the North too, was built on caricature. Butcher, drunkard, lucky amateur propped up by Northern industrial advantage. None of that captures who Grant actually was, and the distance between the caricature and the reality is exactly what let Lee misread him for most of the war. We're going to trace where that caricature came from, what it left out, and the moment it collapsed for good, on a stretch of Virginia countryside where Lee expected Grant to do what every Union general before him had done, and Grant simply didn't. By the time Grant and Lee met as opposing commanders in 1864, Lee had a decade of second-hand information about Grant, and almost none of it was flattering. Grant had served in the Mexican War, competently but unremarkably, under officers who went on to become generals on both sides. Lee wasn't among his direct commanders there, but the officer corps that would later split down the Mason-Dixon line was small enough that reputations traveled. What traveled about Grant was the story of his resignation from the Army in 1854, stationed at a remote post in California, separated from his wife and children for years at a stretch, drinking heavily by most accounts, and resigning his commission rather than face a formal reckoning over it. That story followed him for the rest of his life, and Confederate officers leaned on it hard once the war began. After the Army, Grant's civilian life did nothing to rehabilitate the story. He tried farming on land near St. Louis that his father-in-law had given him, and it failed. He built the farmhouse himself and called it, without irony, hardscrabble. He sold firewood on street corners in the city in a worn army overcoat to men who had once been his social equals. He tried real estate and failed at that too. He took a job as a rent collector and wasn't particularly good at it. By 1860, he was working as a clerk in his younger brother's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, answering to men he outranked in age and experience, earning a modest salary, apparently resigned to a quiet and unremarkable life. This was the man as Southern officers understood him going into the war, a failure who owed his second chance to political connections and Union manpower, not talent. Even Grant's time at West Point did nothing to suggest future greatness. He was an average student, ranked in the middle of his class, more talented on horseback than in the classroom, and reportedly went to the academy in the first place because his father pushed him into it rather than out of any personal ambition. He didn't particularly want a military career. He wanted to teach mathematics. The war with Mexico interrupted that plan, and while Grant served competently as a quartermaster and later saw combat, he came away from that war with a private conviction, one he wrote about later in his memoirs, that it had been an unjust conflict waged against a weaker neighbor for territorial gain. That's not the mindset of a man Southern officers pegged as a natural warrior. It's closer to the opposite. That perception mattered strategically, not just personally. Confederate command, Lee included, spent the first years of the war assuming that whichever general Washington threw at them next would be more of the same. They had reason to think that. McClellan was cautious to the point of paralysis, convinced by faulty intelligence that he was perpetually outnumbered, even when he held a 2-to-1 advantage. Burnside walked his army into a slaughter at Fredericksburg, sending wave after wave of infantry across open ground at entrenched Confederate positions on Marye's Heights. Hooker lost his nerve at Chancellorsville, despite outnumbering Lee more than 2-to-1, retreating after Lee and Jackson executed one of the most bold flanking maneuvers of the war. Meade wanted Gettysburg, but then failed to pursue Lee's battered army back across the Potomac, a decision that frustrated Lincoln to the point of writing, then never sending, a letter expressing his disappointment. Every Eastern theater commander the Union produced through 1863 gave Lee a reason to believe the pattern would hold. And Grant's reputation as a Western general with a drinking problem and a taste for costly frontal assaults fit that pattern perfectly in Confederate minds. When Grant was finally brought east in the spring of 1864 to take overall command, Southern newspapers mocked the appointment. He was, in their telling, a butcher who would trade Union lives for ground the same way his predecessors had, just with less finesse and more bourbon. Lee reportedly told his staff he was not particularly concerned about facing Grant, a comment that reads very differently in hindsight than it did at the time. What that assessment left out was almost everything that actually mattered about Grant as a commander, and it left it out because none of it had happened in the Eastern Theater, where Confederate attention was fixed. Grant's rise came almost entirely in the West, in a string of campaigns that Southern papers barely covered, and Confederate high command apparently didn't study closely enough. It started at Fort Donelson in February 1862. Grant had already taken Fort Henry days earlier with minimal resistance, but Donelson was a harder target, well fortified and stubbornly defended. When the Confederate garrison asked for terms, Grant's reply became one of the most quoted lines of the war: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. The initials of his name, U.S. Grant, were suddenly being read by Northern newspapers as Unconditional Surrender Grant, and it was the first time the Union had a general who talked and fought like he intended to actually win. Then came Shiloh 2 months later, and it nearly ended his career. Confederate forces caught Grant's army by surprise on the first day, drove it back toward the river, and inflicted casualties that shocked the North. Newspapers called for his removal. There were rumors, unfounded but persistent, that he'd been drunk when the attack came. Lincoln reportedly refused to remove him, saying he couldn't spare the man because Grant fought. And Grant did something the Confederate officers would learn to recognize and dread over the following 3 years. He didn't retreat. He reorganized his lines overnight, counterattacked the next morning, and drove the Confederate army off the field. Shiloh became a Union victory, and more importantly, it became the first data point in a pattern that Southern Command failed to register as a pattern at all. Vicksburg, in the spring and summer of 1863, is where Grant's actual military mind is most visible, and it's the part of his record Lee had the least reason to have studied closely. The city sat on high bluffs above the Mississippi, and every conventional approach to it had failed for months. Grant's solution was audacious in a way that had nothing to do with brute force. He marched his army down the west bank of the river, ran gunboats and supply transports past the city's guns at night, crossed his forces back over the river below Vicksburg, and then, most strikingly, cut loose from his own supply lines entirely. For roughly 3 weeks, his army lived off the countryside, foraging for food while moving fast and striking Confederate forces before they could combine against him, winning 5 battles in about 17 days. He then pinned the Confederate army inside Vicksburg and settled into a siege that starved the garrison into submission. The city surrendered on July 4, 1863, the day after Gettysburg ended, and the Mississippi River was entirely in Union hands. It was one of the most complete strategic victories of the entire war, and it was won by a general Confederate command still described as a plodding brawler. Chattanooga followed a few months later, another supposedly hopeless Union position, an army half-starved and pinned against the Tennessee River, with Confederate forces holding the high ground on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge above them. Grant took command, opened a supply route, brought in reinforcements, and orchestrated an assault that broke the Confederate line and sent it retreating into Georgia. By the end of 1863, Grant had delivered the Union 3 of its most significant victories of the war, all in a theater the Eastern press and Eastern officer corps paid comparatively little attention to. None of this fit the caricature, and part of the reason is that Grant didn't look or act like the caricature demanded either. He wore a plain private's coat with only shoulder straps to indicate his rank at a time when other generals rode in front of their staff wrapped in gold braid, and visitors to his headquarters sometimes had trouble picking him out from his own aides. He wrote his own orders in plain, direct prose, without the flourish that characterized a lot of officer correspondence on both sides, favoring short, unambiguous sentences that left subordinates little room to misread what he wanted from them. He gave his subordinate commanders, Sherman especially, wide latitude to execute a broad strategic vision rather than micromanaging their movements. It was Grant working with Sherman who conceived of the war's final phase as a coordinated, multi-front squeeze. Sherman driving through Georgia toward the sea, while Grant pinned Lee in Virginia, denying the Confederacy the ability to shift troops from one crisis to another the way it had for the previous 3 years. That kind of continent-spanning coordination hadn't existed under any prior Union command structure, and it let the Union run pressure campaigns across multiple theaters at once instead of waiting on one general at a time. Grant also had, by every account from the men who served under him, an almost unnerving evenness under pressure. Officers who watched him at Shiloh, with his army nearly broken and driven back toward the Tennessee River, described a man calmly smoking a cigar and giving orders as though the day were going according to plan, which, in his mind, in a sense, it still was. His own aide, Horace Porter, wrote of watching Grant whittle sticks with a pocket knife during the tensest hours of the wilderness fighting, apparently unbothered while officers around him openly worried the campaign was collapsing. It wasn't bravado. Multiple accounts describe it as something closer to genuine calm, the product of a man who had already absorbed public humiliation, financial ruin, and professional failure once before, and come out the other side of it. Losing a battle, or even a war of nerves in a Virginia forest, didn't carry the same terror for Grant that it might have for a man who'd never really failed at anything. Grant's determination is best captured in his own words, in a dispatch he sent from Spotsylvania in May 1864, after 2 days of brutal fighting that had produced no breakthrough and heavy losses on both sides. He wrote to Washington that he intended to fight it out on that line if it took all summer. It sounds like a simple statement, but it was a complete break from how every prior Union commander in the East had operated. Previous generals, after suffering losses like the ones Grant's army took in the wilderness and at Spotsylvania, had pulled back to regroup, giving Lee room to breathe and reset. Grant read the same losses and decided the answer was to keep moving forward. That decision is the moment the entire Confederate assessment of Grant fell apart, and it happened during the Overland Campaign of 1864. The Wilderness, fought in early May, was a brutal, disorienting battle in dense Virginia forest, with casualties running into the tens of thousands on both sides, and no clear tactical winner. Lee, by every account, expected the same outcome he'd gotten against Hooker after Chancellorsville a year earlier. A battered Union army withdrawing back across the river to lick its wounds, while he retained the initiative. That's what had happened every single time before. Instead, when Grant's army moved on the night of May 7th, it moved south, toward Spotsylvania Courthouse, deeper into Virginia, not away from it. Union soldiers who had assumed they were retreating based on years of the same pattern realized as they marched that they were heading toward Richmond instead of away from the fighting, and some accounts describe the men actually cheering when they understood what was happening. Spotsylvania brought nearly 2 more weeks of vicious fighting, including hand-to-hand combat at a salient soldiers nicknamed the Bloody Angle, some of the most sustained close-quarters violence of the entire war, with men fighting across a single earthwork for close to 20 hours straight. Grant did not withdraw. He shifted his army again, sliding southeast, forcing Lee to match him move for move, always trying to get between the Union Army and Richmond, always reacting rather than dictating terms. That reversal alone was a strategic earthquake. For 3 years, Lee had been the one setting the terms of engagement, choosing when and where to strike, forcing Union commanders to respond to him. From the Wilderness onward, that dynamic flipped, and it never fully flipped back. The pattern repeated at North Anna and then again at Cold Harbor in early June, where a Union assault on entrenched Confederate positions produced devastating losses in a matter of minutes and became one of the costliest tactical decisions of Grant's career. Some accounts describe Union soldiers pinning slips of paper with their names and home addresses to their uniforms before the attack, expecting not to survive it. It's the moment most closely associated with the Butcher label, and it's not an unfair criticism of that single attack. Grant himself later wrote that he regretted ordering it. But even after Cold Harbor, Grant didn't stop, and that's the detail Confederate command still hadn't fully absorbed. He disengaged, marched his army south again, crossed the James River in a complex and well-executed logistical operation involving a pontoon bridge more than 2,000 feet long, and struck at Petersburg, the rail hub supplying both Lee's army and the Confederate capital. Petersburg turned into a 9.5-month siege, and it's where Lee's strategic options finally ran out. Grant methodically extended his lines west, cutting one rail line after another feeding into the city, stretching Lee's already thin army further and further to cover ground it didn't have the manpower to hold. There was no dramatic single battle that broke the Confederate position at Petersburg. It was slow strangulation, the direct application of the same principle Grant had used at Vicksburg a year earlier: pin the enemy, cut their supply, and let time and attrition do what a single assault couldn't. Lee understood what was happening to his army long before the end came. He wrote to Confederate leadership that his lines were stretched to the breaking point and that he lacked the men to hold them, warnings that were largely unanswered because the Confederacy simply had no more men to send. By April 1865, those lines finally gave way. Richmond fell, and Lee's army was in open retreat, trying to escape west and link up with Confederate forces still in the field. Grant's cavalry and infantry ran them down within a week, surrounding what remained of the Army of Northern Virginia near a small courthouse town. On April 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee formally surrendered. What happened next tells you almost everything about how badly the Confederate reading of Grant had missed the mark. The busher, the drunk, the crude Westerner whose Southern papers had spent 3 years mocking, offered Lee terms that were remarkably generous. Confederate soldiers were paroled rather than imprisoned or charged, allowed to return home. Officers were permitted to keep their sidearms. At Lee's request, Grant agreed to let Confederate soldiers who owned their own horses or mules keep them, recognizing most were farmers who'd need the animals to work their land and get through the coming year. When Grant's men began firing celebratory salutes at the news of the surrender, he ordered it stopped, reportedly saying the war was over and the Confederates were now countrymen again. It was not the behavior of the man Lee had spent years being told to expect. What Lee didn't know about Grant in the end wasn't a single fact or a hidden secret. It was the whole shape of the man, a failure who had rebuilt himself through sheer persistence rather than talent handed to him early, a strategist whose most brilliant campaigns happened somewhere the Confederate High Command wasn't paying close enough attention, a commander whose plain appearance and blunt language disguised a mind capable of the kind of sustained, coordinated pressure that no single battlefield victory could stop. The Southern press spent years telling its readers and its officers that Grant was a joke, a drunk, a man who would break the same way every previous Union commander had broken. That story was comforting, and it was wrong, and comforting stories that are wrong tend to be the most expensive kind to believe. Lee spent years assuming Grant was just another name in a long line of Union failures, and by the time he understood otherwise, in the tangled woods around Spotsylvania where his opponents simply refused to retreat, it was already too late to change what came next. The man Lee had dismissed as an unrefined Western drunkard turned out to be the one general in the entire war who understood exactly what it would take to end it, and who had the patience, drawn from years of watching his own life fall apart and rebuilding it anyway, to see that plan through no matter what it cost. Let us know in the comments what you think Lee actually believed about Grant before 1864, and whether you think the Confederacy's underestimation of him changed the outcome of the war. Who else do you think history got wrong the first time around, misjudged by the very people who should have known better? Subscribe for more deep dives into the war that's still shaping the country today.